Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So nice to see you in this very early, rainy morning. As I was saying, that we had Professor Martin Feldstein last time, who shared his insights and enlightening views on the current state of global economy, with special focus on the U.S. economy. This morning, we have another authority with different background on these matters. Mr. Charles Dallara was with us a number of times before, so I don't think I need a very long introduction for him. But as you know, he led the Institute for International Finance for nearly 2 decades. Until very recently, he joined a global financial institution, which is called the Partners, which is the Partners Group, which is a global private institutions based in Switzerland. Charles Dallara has had a very outstanding career in both U.S. public sector and the private sector. Actually, I got to know him in late 1980s when he was with U.S. Treasury. He was an important member of Secretary Baker under during the Bush administration era. And then Charles Dallara played a key role in the U.S. government regarding international economic and financial policies. Then he joined IIF. As I said, he exerted his outstanding leadership there, so he expanded the IIF scope of work and the recognition in the world financial community. And prior to that, he was in Morgan Stanley and many other global financial institutions. He's played a very important role. So he has very unique background to talk about the current state of global economy, and particularly on the financial markets and the financial situation, because he has this unique background of policy making in the area, and also he has very practical experiences in this financial markets and the sector. So he will share with us his views on the current state of the global economy, and with special reference to global financial markets. In doing so, I suppose he will give us some of his observations on the Korean economy and the economies in this region as well. Well, with this, with no further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Charles Dallara, my good old friend. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you so much, Yil, for those kind words of introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back in Korea, to be back in Seoul, and to be back as a guest of the Institute of Global Economics. You know, it's developed over the years, I think it's fair to say, and I hope all of you who are here at this early hour on a rainy summer morning appreciate just what reputation IGE has built over the years. as one of, I think, not just one of Asia's leading economic think tanks, but one of the world's leading economic think tanks, and it's due so much to the leadership provided for so many years by Dr. Sugong, and I'm privileged to be able to call him a friend. We began working together almost 30 years ago, perhaps in more challenging circumstances. Today, Korea's current account surplus, I think, is almost approaching 6%. When we started negotiating on exchange rate issues, it was 8.4%. And after the Plaza Accord, which I don't expect too many of you to remember firsthand, but some will. After the Plaza Accord, we engineered a devaluation, a depreciation of the dollar relative to the German mark and the Japanese yen. Imagine the Japanese yen in 1985 was 242 to the dollar. 242 to the dollar. How could we possibly compete with that in global markets? So we managed to engineer a depreciation of the yen and the an appreciation of the yen and the Deutschmark relative to the dollar. But the Korean won was a bit sticky for a while, and we had many discussions with Dr. Sugong. I mentioned to him this morning that yesterday I had the privilege of meeting with your chairman of your Financial Services Commission, and in the room they have the pictures for the last 30, 40 years of all the ministers of finance. And there's a wonderful picture of a young man there. He still looks very much like this man sitting next to me here. But it was my first experience, of course, in working with Korean officials, and I must say I have admired and respected the leadership of Korea for all these years, both in the economic space and in the political space. And of course, as you know, for me, a visit to Korea has a personal dimension, because it was 30 years ago this November when I came here on what I thought was a business trip. And I left here with a little 6-month-old baby in my arms. And people have asked me over the years, what was the most difficult trip you ever took, Charles? Was it negotiating Greece? Was it flying to Japan and having difficult negotiations with the Japanese? Was it going to China? So no, it was bringing a 6-month-old baby by myself home for 24 hours. In those days, in order to get from Seoul to Washington, you had not one but 2 stops. First Tokyo, and then New York. And by the time I got home with my then 6-month-old daughter, now almost 30, I was quite exhausted. But it's been a blessing in my life. So there's a personal connection I have here in Korea, which strengthens my ties and my respect and my affection for this country. Of course, I've had the pleasure of working with Korean businessmen as well. And I've always found them, and businesswomen, and I've always found them to be extremely competitive, but extremely fair. And so I thought I would share with you a brief story this morning about 2 American businessmen who were also competitive, but it wasn't clear they were as fair-minded as Korean businessmen are. There were 2 businessmen who were competitors in a small American town, and they were always after each other's market share, fighting tooth and nail. And they were getting rather old. And 2 angels up in heaven looked down and said, you know, I'm not sure that one of these fellows is a fair businessman. I think he plays underhanded. And the other angel said, no, I think they're both fair. And they said, well, we're going to test them out. So one of the angels came down to the difficult businessman, the one suspected of being underhanded, and said, okay, I'm going to grant you any 3 wishes you want. Any 3 wishes. But there's only one reservation, one caveat. For everything that I grant you, I grant your business competitor 4 times over, 4 times more. And so the businessman was rather shocked. He did not know what to do. So the angel said, okay, give me your first wish. And the businessman said, I want an extra 100 million in earnings next year. And the angel said, okay, but you know your competitor will have an extra 400 million in earnings. And the man said, that's fine. That's fine. So he said, what is your second wish? I want my market cap to double next year. And he said, okay, your market capitalization will double, but you know your competitors will go up 4 times. And the businessman said, I have no problem with that. And so the angels were feeling rather good because they decided this businessman was an honest, fair-minded competitor after all. They said, okay, what is your third and final wish? He said, next year, I would like to have a mild heart attack. Wishing, of course, his competitor 4 times a mild heart attack. I don't know how easy this translates in Korean, but the angels were a bit disappointed because, after all, the man wasn't such a fair businessman. I do want to share with you some thoughts about the global economy. It's been my privilege, as Dr. Sagong said earlier, to have spoken at this August gathering many times over the years. But this is my first time as the Executive Vice Chairman and Chairman of the Americas for Partners Group. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a long advertisement, but I did want to just spend one moment introducing 2 of my colleagues here this morning and saying just a brief word about the Partners Group. First, let me introduce my colleagues here. Over to my left is Mr. Kevin Liu. Kevin is the head of our investor solutions team throughout Asia, based in Singapore, and travels here frequently to support the work led in Korea by Mr. Alex Cho, who's the head of Partners Group office here. And I must say, under his leadership, we've been very fortunate that Alex has built a very strong franchise here for Partners Group. And in brief, Partners Group is what you might call a private equity firm. We call it a private markets firm because we not only invest in equity, but we invest in real estate, in infrastructure, and private debt. Firms like ours are developing an increasingly important role in the world economy, as you know, because every country I visit now, the future of pension funds is more and more important. And Korea is no different. I've already heard during the short 12 hours since I landed about the concerns in Korea about the adequacy of pensions looking out over the years ahead. As Korea's baby boomer generation, and I'm part of it in the U.S., and perhaps Dr. Sagong is part of it in some of you here, ages, we are all going to be increasingly looking to the value of our pensions. Firms like ours can provide added value by generating sustainable, lower volatility and higher returns over a period of time. Private equity firms are not for short-term investors. If you want to make a quick buck, don't come to us, because we are for pension funds, insurance firms, sovereign wealth funds, and private individuals who are looking to enhance their returns over a period of some years. And we do that by investing in companies directly, by investing in groups of companies in primary or secondary markets, by investing in infrastructure. And we do this globally. Partners Group is a very globally integrated firm, headquartered in Switzerland with major offices in Singapore, in London, in New York, San Francisco, but with important offices in Korea. And we're very privileged to have developed strong relations with many of your pension funds, with your sovereign wealth fund, and with your insurance firms. And we're also very privileged to have already invested some 100 million directly into the Korean economy. And we look forward to building that investment even stronger during the years ahead. You know, today's world economy is facing many, many uncertainties. To use the rather awkward terms of our former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, I never liked this phrase, so I'm not sure why I'm using it, but I think you will understand. There are known knowns and there are known unknowns. And as we sit here today, I think what makes looking at the outlook for the world economy so difficult is trying to make judgments not only about the known knowns, and I'll mention a few of those, but about the known unknowns. And when is something moving from the category of a known unknown to a known known? 2 months ago, you would have said, I would have said probably, or 4 months ago, that geopolitical risks inject a known unknown into the global outlook. As a result of incidents in Ukraine and the Middle East over the last few weeks, maybe this is changing and migrating into the known category. What do I mean by that? You pick up the paper or you read the news on your iPad, and what do you see? A discussion of increased sanctions against Russia. Now, the initial reaction might be, well, the Europeans still don't have that much determination to implement sanctions against Russia. And that well may be the case, but have the dynamics changed? 298 citizens killed in this tragedy, and well over half of them are European citizens. Is the patience of European leadership going to begin to tip the balance towards sanctions which this time could have a more direct and lasting impact on the Russian economy? As you well know, we're in a remarkably interconnected world today, and what happens in Russia can affect what is happening in Korea through so many different channels. Looking at energy markets, Russia remains the second largest oil producer in the world. It provides 35% of the gas to much of Western Europe. There's a codependency there which makes these issues of economic and financial sanctions very difficult. Russian banks operate all around the world. Russian corporations operate all around the world. If we see an increasing pressure on economic and financial sanctions, at what point is this going to first affect the energy markets by pushing oil prices up again, perhaps substantially, thereby affecting the global recovery? Or at what point are economic sanctions going to really begin to financial sanctions going to really begin to disrupt the operations of global financial markets? You know, recently you've seen some of the consequences of other institutions in Europe not abiding by U.S. law. Now, I'm not a great advocate of extraterritorial application of U.S. law. I've always believed that when applying sanctions, they should be done through the mutual collaborative agreement of the allies. But the U.S. does, in today's global marketplace, have a tremendous capacity to implement difficult and biting financial sanctions, even without other countries going along. Some Western European financial institutions have recently discovered this, paying massive fines because they violated not British or French or German law, because they violated American law. Will we find a situation where the intensification of economic and financial sanctions on Russia not only damage severely the Russian economy, but have spillover effects into global markets? I think there is a serious risk of this, and I think that that risk is underscored by the still rather modest momentum in the global economic recovery. Here we are today, almost 6 years after the onset of the global financial crisis. And notwithstanding the dramatic improvements in the unemployment rate in the U.S., we still in the U.S. have 1 million more unemployed, 1 million more unemployed citizens than we did 6 years ago. We dug ourselves such a massive hole as a result of this global financial crisis and that frightening period between the fall of 2008 and, I would say, the fall of 2009, when the world economy was almost in free fall. Fortunately, we had leaders at the time in the G20 process, and I remember the G20 in the spring of 2009. I remember the subsequent G20s where Korea and Dr. Sogong in particular played a vital role in building confidence among market participants through G20 leadership. But as the crisis began to fade, I think it's fair to say that over the last year or two, with all respect, the effectiveness of G20 leadership has been called into question as more and more countries do their own thing again. And each country now is left to try to struggle to find its own new sources of global economic growth. You know, in the U.S., of course, you might say we're doing better than most. Recovery is underway, but is it really very strong? Is it very resilient? Is it very robust? I would say no. The first quarter was a very cold shower for most of us following the U.S. economy, with a very sharp contraction. Now, indeed, I can tell you for first-hand experience, it was a nasty winter in the U.S. I moved to New York for the first time in many years, and I thought spring would never come. But it's not all just about weather. I think we have problems in the housing market. We have problems in our manufacturing. We have a tax structure which is not really encouraging businessmen to invest. And we have a global marketplace which is rather languid. We also have some deep problems in the quality of our labor force in the U.S. that are related to our educational system, which is a marvelous system at the university level, but not so marvelous at all at the primary and the secondary level, and we don't seem to quite know how to fix it. Of course, if you look around the rest of the world, you also see question marks on the global economic horizon. You know, I spent almost 2 years negotiating what turned out to be the largest debt restructuring in history, the Greek debt restructuring. And I saw Europe inside the belly, so to speak, because I was thrust on behalf of all of the private creditors into the middle of the European decision-making apparatus. With all respect for my European friends and colleagues, when you look at Europe from the inside, it's ugly. The lack of a coherent framework around the European Union and around the Eurozone is profoundly hindering the European economic recovery. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. When I went to first negotiate the Greek debt restructuring, I was invited by the European Commission, by the ECB, to lead the creditors. And I was asked, well, who am I negotiating with? And they said, well, we'll try to figure that out, Charles. And so I went to a meeting organized initially by the Deputy Finance Minister of Italy. And I was told that he was in charge of all of the deputy ministers of the Eurozone. And I said, fine. So I sat across the table, and there was the Italian minister, there was the Greek officials, the IMF, the ECB, the European Commission, Germans, the French, Polish officials, even some Finnish and other officials. And I tried to determine for 3 hours who I was negotiating with. And no one seemed to want to take the lead on the other side. And this very good, kind Italian gentleman said, well, I guess I have to be in charge here. But I really don't want to be. I said, why is that? He said, well, because if we negotiate a restructuring of Greece's debt, then Italy may be next in line. And it was clear that no one was in charge. And this continued all the way through almost 2 years of negotiations, highly technical matters that should have been dealt with at a ministerial or a sub-ministerial level were pushed all the way up to the head of state. I'll give you another example. We had a debate about a term that the IMF loves. I don't. But it became the fixation of these negotiations. Debt sustainability. We want to restore Greece to debt sustainability. What a grand idea. What a grand notion. And somehow they came to the view that if Greece's debt in the future were 120% of GDP, that this is going to be sustainable. Never mind that they were not looking at the maturity structure of the debt. Never mind that they were not really looking at the confidence which markets may have to recapitalize the Greek debt. Never mind that, unfortunately, anytime you focus on the nominal level of debt and the economy continues to shrink, it's like chasing a rabbit down a hole. You cannot improve that ratio because the numerator may be shrinking, but the denominator is shrinking more rapidly. We had some very tough negotiations. I said, get me somebody who can actually speak with authority on the issue of debt sustainability. So I went all the way up the line in Europe, and finally one morning at 3 o'clock I was exasperated, and the Italian gentleman said, I have someone who's going to resolve the debt sustainability issue with you, Charles. I said, good, who is it? Chancellor Merkel. So I ended up discussing with the Chancellor of Germany detailed issues of debt sustainability because no one else in Europe could take responsibility for resolving the issue. As you know, they created a common currency, but they failed to build around that the supportive framework for common fiscal policy, a common regulatory and financial framework. And they certainly do not have today a vision that can lead to an eventual federalist structure for European political convergence. Without these other building blocks, and with the current emphasis on fiscal consolidation in Southern Europe, and with so little emphasis on structural changes in the European economies, it looks to me as if even the medium-term horizon for European recovery will continue to be very tepid. What is troubling, of course, is that in Europe, as in the U.S., markets have separated somewhat from fundamentals. If you look at the improvements in the capital market tone for European sovereign debt, you would think these are the strongest countries in the world. 3 months ago, I had a call from the Greek Prime Minister saying, Charles, I hope you saw that today we issued our first bond in the capital markets since the debt restructuring, and I just wanted to thank you for all you did to prepare the basis for this. And I said, well, congratulations, Mr. Prime Minister. It's a big achievement. But wouldn't you feel better if unemployment was closer to 10% than 26%? The reality is that markets have become so obsessed with looking for return that they're actually willing now to buy back into Italian government paper, Spanish government paper, Greek government paper, even though these economies are still struggling. Why is that? I think it comes back fundamentally to the remarkable quantitative easing that we have pursued in the U.S. for the last years. I believe that in the first year or two after the crisis, this quantitative easing was absolutely essential to stabilize the global economy. And I congratulate the central banks and global leaders who were willing to pursue this aggressive monetary policy. But since that time, I am increasingly concerned that we are feeding an environment that's going to eventually lead to a train wreck. How many of you have ever had the opportunity to visit the northeast portion of Canada called Nova Scotia? Has anyone here ever had that privilege? I know it's a long ways from Seoul. It's a beautiful area. Beautiful area. I happen to now serve on the board of Scotia Bank. So once a year, we go back to Nova Scotia for our board meetings. But in the late 19th century, there was a gentleman named Houdini, Harry Houdini, who went on tour in Nova Scotia. Now, I'm sure you all know who Harry Houdini is, the great magician. But what do you remember about Houdini? You remember him as an escape artist, right? Someone who would tie himself up with chains and drop into the sea or something and escape. This is not how he started. He started by introducing to the world for the first time the most impressive acts of levitation, suspending gravity around a woman's body. She was named Bess, and they became married. They were not just business partners, but a married couple. And he would actually suspend her in air, 3-4 feet off the ground. This levitation act worked remarkably well for 3 years. He was making so much money, he was having so much fun and so successful. He was doing this all in the Canadian provinces. And then he said, well, I'm going to take my act to the U.S. I'm going to go to New York. So we got on a ship, and he started heading down from Newfoundland to New York. And guess what happened? His levitation equipment was lost. It must have fallen overboard. Never again was he able to levitate Bess. And for a while, he struggled. He had no income. Why am I telling you this strange story? Because I think this is what the Federal Reserve is doing to financial markets for 3 years now. They're levitating them. It's great magic. We all love it if our investments have been in the U.S. equity market the last 2 years. It's been a great run. But how long can any central bank in today's world suspend reality and take financial markets in such a divergent path from underlying fundamentals? Over the last 2.5 years, the S&P has gone up well over 50%, the S&P index in the U.S. Only 24% of that, only 1/4 of that, is attributable to growth in earnings. Now, as an executive in a private equity firm, I've learned one hard and fast rule. The cash flow and earnings tells a lot about the future outlook for any company in the world. So if earnings are only going up a small amount, but values are going up a large amount, is this sustainable? I think we all have to be concerned about this. We have all been impressed by the effects of quantitative easing. But have we been slightly seduced by this levitation act? If you look at the last 1.5 years, well, market valuations have been going straight up. Forecasts of global GDP growth have been going straight down. Yes, the recovery is still underway, but every organization, the IMF, the World Bank, my old organization, the IIF, and others, have been steadily marking down the growth forecast. Last year at this time, everybody thought the world growth average this year would be 3.2%. Now we think it's going to be 2.5%. So we're marking down growth expectations, but we're marking up financial asset valuations. This is posing a real challenge, and I'm afraid that it's positioning us for a rude awakening as the Fed begins to move forward with the inevitable ending of QE3 and the inevitable rises in interest rates. Now, this evolution in Fed policy is, of course, something you might call a known. We all know it's going to happen, but we just don't know exactly when and how things are going to happen. It's not that we lie awake at night fearing so much that 10-year rates in the U.S. may eventually be 4.5%, and they will be. But we don't know the path, and we don't know the volatility. I recall, when we were negotiating the Plaza Accord, we had to convince Chairman Volcker that this was a wise thing. The dollar was grossly overvalued, and we had him over for breakfast one day, and this was Secretary Baker. I was with him. Paul had a staff member, and we said, Paul, you've got to work with us and support us in bringing down the value of the dollar. 242 yen to the dollar doesn't make sense. Why don't we get it down to around 120? He said, Dallaire, I would love to see 120 yen to the dollar. That's not what frightens me. It's the process of getting there that keeps me awake, because I'm afraid we'll go through a period of huge volatility and market anxiety. Well, that's what should concern us today. How do we get to a world of more normal rates without a lot of damage being done to global markets, to investors, and to the global economic recovery? Today we have all been encouraged to look for risks, and there's a lot of money going into risk assets around the world. We in the U.S., as globally, compete for opportunities to lend into the subordinated debt market, and to a certain extent we compete for lenders who are lending into the high yield debt market. This market has become so hot with liquidity pouring into it that we don't feel that we can get adequate returns in the U.S. today for subordinated debt, at least not in many deals. And we are concerned that markets in general are so willing to chase yield and to look for risky assets that when those economic sanctions really begin to bite, or when there's some other unknown event, or when markets react unanticipatedly to the Federal Reserve's moves, that we could have a period of real disruption in global financial markets. Last year, no one expected that Chairman Bernanke, and this includes him, former Chairman Bernanke, would make comments that would provoke turbulence in the U.S. markets and in global flows to emerging markets. He did, inadvertently, and quickly 10-year rates in the U.S. went from 1.6 to 2.6. Will that happen again next year? Who knows? I certainly have all the respect in the world for Chair Yellen. I was at a meeting with her not too long ago, and I called her Chairwoman Yellen, and she said, no, Charles, I prefer to be called just Chair. And so I don't use the term Chairwoman anymore out of respect for her. But I have all the respect in the world for her, but she is no magician. She is no Houdini. She is not the Delphic oracle. You know, even in Delphi, all of the leaders of Greece listened to a female oracle. By the way, the Delphic oracle was only a female, so just like Yellen. But after 3 centuries, they started getting it wrong, and so they put aside the Delphic oracle. My point is that there is no one out there that can control market sentiment. You can control short-term rates, but not market sentiment. Let me conclude with just a couple of observations on China and Korea, if I may, because I haven't said much about emerging markets. It's clear that emerging markets continue to hold out the hope for some global recovery. But if you look at most major emerging markets today, their growth outlook is weaker today than it was a year and a half ago. China, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, South Africa, Indonesia. Maybe the only exception there is India with the arrival of a new government, which I think has given some hope there of changes in the Indian economy, which may revitalize what is an overregulated economy. But all of these countries, many of them are in the process of political change, some of which could lead to improvements, some of which may not. I was just in Brazil a few months ago, and you have a presidential election coming up there, and a very discouraged business community. Were I at a breakfast in Sao Paulo today with businessmen and women of Brazil, not of Korea, 80 or 90% of you would tell me you've lost confidence in your president. We don't know what the outcome of the Brazilian elections will be. Were I in Istanbul today at a gathering of Turkish businesswomen and businessmen, a large percentage would say they're very, very concerned about the evolution of the political system and indeed, to a certain extent, democratic institutions in Turkey. So there are a lot of questions going on, not the least of which are taking place in China, of course. And it's not up to me to stand here today to speculate about long-term evolution in China's political system. But I will say that in spite of the extraordinarily skillful leadership team which they have in China today, that trying to manage the Chinese economy today is a bit like trying to fly a 2014 Boeing jet with 1985 control panel. They don't have the policy framework to really manage an economy that is becoming so dynamic, that is less and less under the control of the state. And yet state enterprises are still an important part of the Chinese economy. They have a banking system which is still so tied to government policy. And you know in Korea how important it is to try to separate the world of banking and finance from politics. Because if you don't, inevitably, mistakes are made. And in China, they are struggling to separate the world of banking from politics. They're struggling to cope with the development of a huge shadow banking system, which we still don't fully understand. It's not to say that I expect any dramatic collapse in the Chinese economic growth rate. I don't. I think it'll continue to moderate down in the next year or two below 7%. But I do expect that we're going to see unfortunate surprises coming out of the Chinese shadow banking system, which, while they may not disrupt fundamentally the Chinese economy, they will affect market sentiment. And market sentiment is so important because unless we can maintain confidence among investors and consumers around the world, we will not have the kind of recovery that we need. Finally, just a thought or two on Korea. You know, it's always impressive for me to come back and see how well many aspects of the Korean economy are doing. After that horrific period, some 15, 16 years ago, you now have a very strong banking system. You have a very competitive economy. You have diversified your export base. You have remarkably low unemployment. Maybe you take it for granted, but I mean, how many economies of this size in the world today have an unemployment rate this low? None? None? I don't think there's anyone else that I can think of that is as large as Korea with an unemployment rate this low. But of course, as you should, Korea is not just basking on your achievements. You're looking at the challenges in the years ahead, and that's where there are many challenges. Can Korea create a more dynamic middle market set of companies that are able to innovate and compete? Is the Korean economy still so regulated for new entrants, for new competitors? that it's very difficult for the creativity that you need here in Korea to really to be translated into business reality. Is Korea itself looking again at some risks in shadow banking? Is Korea prepared to move forward with what I thought was a great vision, but which has not fully materialized, and that is the development of Seoul as a financial center? I came here some years ago participating in a program organized just around that concept. And I must say I was very encouraged, but these are very difficult concepts. And they are even more difficult to translate into reality. It requires change across a whole range of governmental organizations. It requires strong and sustained leadership. I would encourage Korea to revitalize that initiative because I think it can be very important to the future of the Korean economy. Can Korean industry, which is so strong in Korea, build a sufficiently strong presence around the world, not just with exports, but with investments in the United States, in Europe, and throughout emerging markets, so that Korean enterprise is truly global? I think these are some of the challenges which Korea faces today. They are certainly, as far as I can see, very manageable challenges, and I arrive here and quickly form the same impression that I always have when I've been in Korea, which is whatever the hurdles are, that the Korean leadership and business community will overcome them. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us your very insightful views on the global economy and some observations on the Korean economy and Korean society. By the way, Charles mentioned that he made a trip to U.S. with a 6-month-old girl. Actually, Charles adopted Korea-born girl. That's why he had to carry 6 months old. And by the way, she's doing very, very well. Maybe as she got married now.
She's married. She has 2 children.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, her Korean language skills are not as strong.
As in wonderful. Please applause. Well, I don't think I will attempt to summarize what he has said, but he made many views and observations, and also he left with many questions. And so with this, I suppose we would like to entertain any questions or comments from the floor. So anyone? Yes, okay, okay, we'll collect to Dr. Kim first, and then, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Charles Dallara, for your enlightening presentation. I understand you used to be, or still are, one of the leading authorities in the exchange rate policy. Some time ago, Professor Koichi Hamada of Yale University visited Korea, and he is known to be the designer of Abenomics, and reporters, Korean reporters, complained about Abenomics because of what they call the beggar thy neighbor policy. And he replied by saying that, yeah, why don't you Koreans go for the same thing, perhaps QE, because Japan is going for QQE, and Korea might as well go for QE. So my question is, do you think Korea should go for quantitative easing at this point? And if it does, what should be the things or the problems that we should be aware of or be careful about?
Okay, yes. Let me see, yes, another very distinguished journalist. Go microphone, yes. Okay, yes, with those two.
Well, shall I take these 2 and then we can open it up for more? Both very difficult, particularly for 8 o'clock in the morning. QE. Actually, I don't think that Korea is in the circumstances where you need to seriously consider massive quantitative easing. I think there is scope here in Korea for some stimulus policy in fiscal, perhaps monetary, deregulatory. And I'm told that there may be some new initiatives these very days by the government. But I don't see the need for Korea to take the risk, to be honest with you, of massive quantitative easing. Korea, I don't even see the need for a moderate quantitative easing, to be honest with you. You know, it's always so difficult, isn't it, to put monetary policy in the right context. We have become so enamored that we think monetary policy can do anything and everything, and I'm just not a fundamental believer in this. Of course, quantitative easing has helped restore some confidence in the Japanese economy, but will this be short-lived or long-lived? This will not depend upon quantitative easing. It will depend upon the so-called second and third eras. As far as I can see, one of those eras is still largely in the quiver. Abe hasn't really tackled fundamentally some of the structural problems of the Korean economy. He has made some moves in fiscal policy, but it's very difficult because with this long-term debt problem and this huge fiscal imbalance which has accumulated this debt over the years, here they are having to increase value-added tax right as they're trying to promote a recovery. I would encourage Korea to look more at structural issues, at the way in which your economy is organized. How do you create a more competitive system? How do you, for new entrants into every sector of the Korean economy, how do you create a financial system which is willing to finance creative ideas? How do you ensure that Korea is positioned globally? Korean corporations are positioned globally here. How do you further advance deregulation in an economy which still shows some signs, in my view, of overregulation? I've seen efforts by Korea to deregulate for years, but you know, the Korean system was built in the post-war period, as you know better than I do, with very strong bureaucracy. Probably still too strong in some sectors, to be quite honest with you, and I say that as an ex-bureaucrat. So I don't think the answers to Korea particularly lie in the QE direction. Economic and financial sanctions, you raise a very good question, and I was saying something a little different. I'm not saying so much that they will work, but I'm saying they could affect global market sentiment, and I think that's a different issue. They can, it depends on what one means by work. Of course, in the case of Russia, were the sanctions to be applied to their energy corporations in a broad fashion, this would have a dramatic effect on the Russian economy, but unfortunately also a dramatic effect on global energy markets and on European energy supplies. So I don't think that will happen. I was involved in any number of initiatives over the years to apply sanctions. When hostages were seized in Iran in '79, we implemented sanctions immediately. I was a junior officer at the Treasury Department. This was November '79, you may recall. Did the sanctions have much impact? I don't think so. When Saddam invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, again, we applied sanctions, this time more multilaterally. Did they have impact immediately? No. But I think that in the case of Iran more recently, I actually think that the sanctions applied against Iran these last few years have had some effect in moderating some of their aggressive behavior. It's hard to know how it would react. I think Russia is such a nationalistic country at times that it's unlikely that sanctions would have much effect on their foreign policy or their security initiatives. And Putin might even be more popular in the future with sanctions than he is today. But my concern is that it could spill over to global market sentiment and throw one more wet blanket on the global economic recovery.
Yeah. Well, if I may, regarding the QE, add to what Charles Dallara just said. QE is actually a unconventional monetary policy. So when there is a room for conventional monetary policy, I suppose we better take conventional monetary policy before we take unconventional. Korea fortunately has a room for, still room for conventional monetary policy. But I don't think Dr. Kim may advocate that. But in any case, I think we still have a room for conventional monetary policy. Well, okay, Mr. He and Dr. Cho.
Well, Mr. Dallara, I have one comment and I have one question. One comment is about the partners group. When I worked at OECD, I had the privilege to visit the company at Switzerland with the help of Alex Joe. I talked with the management and learned about the impressive track record because they are very highly recommended by the KIC. At the time, they were very happy and proud to have you as a chairman. And I guess the decision is more than confirmed today with your excellent speech that covers the whole world. As for the question, you just mentioned basically there's a disconnect between the actual economic performance in terms of the growth rate and the performance in the financial market to the extent that there is already a complacency or almost a mini bubble in the financial market. But on the other hand, there's a view recently by people like Larry Summers that in the advanced economy there's a secular stagnation when the equilibrium interest rate might be negative. So that in order to have a certain level of growth, mini bubble is inevitable to the extent that you might need a longer term quantitative easing or fiscal stimulus until those time that economy is really recovered well enough. So what is your perspective on these two seemingly slightly different point of view? How do you reconcile those two different point of view? Mini bubble, the risk of a mini bubble versus the inevitability because of the low performance of the economic growth.
Okay, Dr. Cho. Yes.
Thank you. Actually, my question and comments were similar to what Ambassador He said. Thank you very much for your many insights. What you said about the S&P and the financial asset valuation will make us awake many nights in the future. And I agree with your point that from the current status to the normal level of interest rate and the new financial asset valuation, the path will be very uncertain, and also there could be many bumpy roads to that. But as Ambassador He said, some people talks about new normal, including Larry Summers and others. Looks like that you think that future normal level of interest rate, TB 10 years, could be about 4.5% or could be higher. But some people say that 1 or 2 may continue for a sustained period as a new normal. What do you think is the basis of the difference between your perspective and their perspective on the current status of the world economy?
Okay, one more. Yes, question.
예, 저는 케미컬 에너지 투자자문의 장우선이라고 합니다. 중국 관련돼서 말씀해 주셨는데요.
Okay, ready? Okay, yeah.
섀도우 뱅킹 시스템이라든지 이런 데 문제가 발생할 수 있다고 하셨는데 구체적으로 중국에서 발생할 리스크가 뭔지 궁금합니다. 예, 감사합니다.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the kind comments about Partners Group. You've asked a few difficult questions here. Is a bubble, at least a mini bubble, somewhat inevitable? Again, I don't challenge the necessity of some of the stimulus measures that took place 2009, 10, perhaps even into 2011. But it goes to some fundamental questions as to how much you can realistically expect about monetary policy. I find it ironic that every June the Bank for International Settlements, which represents all the central bankers in the world, issues an annual report which systematically says, you, the world, expect too much of central bankers. Why don't you take care of things through governmental policies and fiscal policies and structural policies? And then they go back to operating in this world, which almost is in a cocoon of exaggerated expectations. Let's not forget, we did try massive stimulus, not only with 3 rounds now of quantitative easing, but with a very strong impulse of fiscal spending in the U.S., which virtually doubled our debt to GDP in a fairly short period of time. I think one has to really ask the question, for sustainable long-term growth, what else do we need to do? What about tax reform? If you look at the effective tax rate on U.S. corporations, it's among the highest in the OECD world. Now, you can say they don't pay all these taxes, they keep profits overseas, which is true. But why do they do that? Partly because our corporate tax rate, our corporate tax structure is a monster of complexity, and it is also perpetrating a very high rate. We are in the process of now increasing taxes on certain areas of our most innovative sector. Biotech and biopharma has been at the forefront of creativity in the world economy over the last decade, but we're increasing the taxes on them. I don't think we have a coherent fiscal strategy in the U.S., certainly not in the medium term. Neither party in our governmental system seems prepared to tackle the medium-term liabilities that we face as a country. And these are the longer-term issues where I think leadership is needed, not just continuing to rely so heavily on monetary policy, to be quite honest with you. There is a fair question, what is a new normal here? And none of us really knows. But my own view is that eventually the Fed will have to come back into the atmosphere of traditional monetary policy. And the sooner we are courageous enough to begin that process, the better, because the longer we encourage investors around the world to continue to look for risky assets, the greater the probability that when the old world comes back to us and the Fed has to re-enter ordinary policy, there can be severe consequences for a shift away from risk investment, high-risk investment, to low-risk investment. This could disrupt emerging markets all over the world, and it could disrupt financial markets in the U.S. as well. I'll tell you one, since I think we still have a few minutes, I'll tell you one other story that illustrates the problem we have here. A few years ago, I had the honor of meeting a true American hero, John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit into outer space in orbit, February of 1962. And I said, Senator Glenn, he's been a U.S. Senator for many years, what was it like to go into outer space? He said, oh, young man, that was fun. We just fueled those rockets, and I've been flying fast jets all my life, and so we just went off into the sky. He said, but coming back into the atmosphere frightened the hell out of me, because we'd never done it before. We didn't know what we were doing. The heat shield was about to come off. I thought I might never survive. He said, it's always fun when you go into outer space. I think this is a bit what the Federal Reserve has done. With all respect for them, I think that they do not know, and none of us know quite how to navigate the reentry, and we should be cautious and prudent and not be arrogant about assuming that we do. And just because we keep telling the world that we know how to navigate reentry doesn't mean we really do. On China, shadow banking, I don't want to exaggerate the problem here, but the difficulty is that the shadow banking system has grown up largely outside, but still connected through the more traditional banking system. Many of the new assets that have been created to create attractive investment opportunities in this low-yield world, again, we come back to low yield, people chasing return and high risk. These assets have been backed, or at least they flow through the balance sheets of many traditional banks in China. Those banks are not prepared to back up these structures, but the investors think that they are prepared to back up the structure. So you have a potential for some real misunderstandings to arise here, I think. And I also believe that the structures, the interest rate structures in much shadow banking, is not geared for a slower growth environment, right? Because these are often short-term claims, very high interest rates, and businessmen and businesswomen who face a decelerating cash flow may have severe difficulties. We could have municipal bankruptcies. We could have small and middle-sized corporate bankruptcies. And we could have some real tensions around where the banking system is in sorting out all of the problems here. Ultimately, the Chinese government will, of course, provide stability to the system. But, you know, the last time we had some bankruptcy issues in China was after the Asian financial crisis. It was in '99. And at that point, these banks were wholly owned by China. Today, 20 or 30% of these banks, in many cases, is owned by global investors or Western financial institutions. The linkages are much tighter today, and the potential for Chinese issues to create contagion in global markets is much greater than it was 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe just another round of questions, if there are some. Okay, before I do that, I just want to interrupt to recognize we have the members of Bond Forum as consisting of Korea's female leaders in public and private sectors. Bond Forum members there, please.
Pleasure to have you.
Yes, yes. 조금 일어났어요. Yes, yes. Yes. You know, we not only have female president, but also it's a very active female leaders in every sector. Okay, and then we have the new participant is AJ Kanwal. He's the Standard Chartered Bank Korea CEO. He first joined with us this morning. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sakam. Charles, quick question from my side. You know, this rich and poor divide, the income disparity, pretty much a challenge in the developed world, actually becoming equally an issue in the developing world. Your thoughts on two things. How serious is this? And to your experience in seeing countries which have managed it much better.
Well, before I try to tackle that, let me just congratulate the female leadership with us here today and the many initiatives that are taking place in Korea. To boost the role of women in the Korean economy. One of the encouraging things about Korea today is that I hear a very good debate about how to make policy changes to encourage a more sustainable and long-term engagement of women in the workforce here. And as we all know, it's not just about women at the top. It's also about women at all levels in an economy. And I think when I come back again to whether, Korea needs QE, I would much rather see the participation rate of women in this economy increase significantly. And that would do much more good, I think, than all the QE that could be imagined anywhere. And this is an issue that I think really Korea should be seized with, and you are, and I congratulate you for it. I think we are facing a growing problem of a divide between the rich and the poor in so many economies around the world. And I think our political leadership is really challenged. The answer is clearly not just about taxing the rich, although an equitable burden of tax system, an equitably based tax system is certainly important. I think it goes to some of these very fundamental issues of educational systems and equal opportunity. The percentage of babies born out of wedlock in the United States today is steadily rising, and not just in some of the minority sectors, but in the core population. And it's more and more difficult for family units to be created that can actually create a stable framework for raising children and generating wealth. We need to look at the fundamental factors that are influencing that in our societies today, in my view. I also think that we need to look at how, again, to cope in our democracies with the power of the elderly. In the United States, and I don't know if it's the same here, but it's very hard to get changes to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid because people my age and older have such a strong influence on the vote. Now, Asian culture emphasizes treating the next generation properly and with respect. Somehow, in some of our Western cultures, we seem to have lost a little sense of that because we are today passing along huge burdens of debt to the next generation. And if governments talk about, and this is why no party seems willing to take the lead here, to talk about actually means testing some aspects of Social Security. I may not need as much Social Security as some other people my age. That's the fundamental reality. Now, I could tell the government, I earned it, I deserve it, I want to pass it along to my children. But my generation, I think, in the United States, and maybe even in Korea, has to have a long view if we are to overcome these issues, and our politicians have to be willing to challenge us and not just pass this burden along if we are to solve this rich-poor divide, in my view.
Okay, with this, I think we have to close this session, and we appreciate very much for sharing with us your very illuminating views. I just want, before closing, I just want to underline what Mr. Dallara has said. That is that since we have a new the economic policy team, I just would like to underline, highlight what Mr. Dallara mentioned about this importance of structural adjustments and deregulation in that regard, and to be concerned with the medium to long-term issues as well as tackling short-term cyclical issues. Because we have to be concerned with our growth potential, which is declining rather fast. I suppose we can do so many more things in that regard. Actually, utilizing our female the workforce is one in the part of that effort endeavor, I suppose. Actually, Korean female workforce is the most highly educated workforce in the world, but the least utilized. So, of course, I don't think they solved the whole economic problem, but I think that can be a very, very important contributing factor. So, we have a lot of challenges and a lot of policy tasks. I hope a new team will tackle all these problems. Well, with this, let's close. And please, again, join me in thanking Mr. Dallara. Thank you very much.